Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. And the good news is, NATO is more united and more determined than ever. There is no doubt that the United States and every NATO ally will meet our Article 5 commitments, which says that an attack on one is an attack on all. Over the past few weeks, I ordered thousands of additional forces to Germany and Poland as part of our commitment to NATO. On Tuesday, in response to Russia's aggressive action, including its troop presence in Belarus and the Black Sea, I've authorized the deployment of ground and air forces already stationed in Europe to NATO's eastern flank allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. And today, within hours of Russia's unleashing its assault, NATO came together and authorized and activated an activation of response plans. This will enable NATO's high readiness forces to deploy and when and where they are needed to protect our NATO allies on the eastern boundaries of Europe. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO. As we respond, my administration is using the tools, every tool at its disposal to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost, and American oil and gas companies should not exploit this moment to hike their prices to raise profits. You know, in our sanctions package, we specifically designed to allow energy payments to continue. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We've been coordinating with major oil producing and consuming countries toward our common interest to secure global energy supplies. We are actively working with countries around the world to elevate collective release from the strategic petroleum reserves of major energy consuming countries. And the United States will release additional barrels of oil as conditions warrant. I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. But this aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden our cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country. We'll provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. And in the early days of this conflict, Russia propaganda outlets will keep trying to hide the truth and claim success for its military operation against a made-up threat. But history has shown, time and again, how swift gains in territory eventually give way to grinding occupations, acts of mass civil disobedience, and strategic dead ends. The next few weeks and months will be hard on the people of Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a great pain on them, but the Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence. They have repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. This is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, for the freedom around the world. Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased by from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail. God bless the people of a free and democratic Ukraine, and may God protect our troops.
Mr. President.
Associated Press, Zeke.
So do you have any plans to speak with President Putin at this point? And what interactions have you had with the Russian government?
I heard the first part. Do I have any plans to speak with Putin at this point, and what?
What communications have you had with the Kremlin as far as military operations in Ukraine and making sure this does not spiral into a larger conflict?
Well, it's a large conflict already. The way we're going to ensure it's not going to aspire to a larger conflict is by providing all the forces needed in the Eastern European nations that are members of NATO. NATO is more united than it's ever been, and I have no plans to talk with Putin. Wall Street Journal, Tarina.
Mr. President, you didn't mention SWIFT in your sanctions that you announced. Is there a reason why the U.S. Isn't doing that? Is there a disagreement among allies regarding SWIFT and whether Russia should be allowed to be a part of it?
The sanctions that we've proposed on all their banks have of equal consequence, maybe more consequence than SWIFT, number one. Number two, it is always an option, but right now that's not the position that the rest of Europe wishes to take. Cecilia Vega, ABC.
Sir, sanctions clearly have not been enough to deter Vladimir Putin to this point. What is going to stop him? How and when does this end? And do you see him trying to go beyond Ukraine? And a second question I'll just give to you now. This statement that he gave last night, the threat that he gave, the West will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. Is he threatening a nuclear strike?
I have no idea what he's threatening. I know what he has done, number one. And number two, no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening. It has to show, this is going to take time, and we have to show resolve so he knows what's coming. And so the people of Russia know what he's brought on them. That's what this is all about. This is going to take time. It's not going to occur, he's going to say, oh my God, these sanctions are coming, I'm going to stand down. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together, and we will. We will, and it will impose significant costs on him.
Will he go beyond Ukraine, sir? Do you see him going beyond?
Yes.
Two topics, just really quick. First, markets are down and gas prices are up. I know you always stress the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, but everybody seems to be in for some economic pain. How economically painful is it going to get for people in this country? And I do have one more question.
First of all, there's no doubt that when a major nuclear power attacks and invades another country, that the world is going to respond, and markets can respond all over the world. So there's no doubt about that, number one. Number two, the notion that this is going to last for a long time is highly unlikely as long as we continue to stay resolved in imposing the sanctions we're going to impose on Russia, period. What's the next question? I'm sorry.
The next question is, did you underestimate Putin, and would you still describe him the way that you did in the summer as a worthy adversary?
At the time, he was, I made it clear, as an adversary, and I said he was worthy. I didn't underestimate him. And I've read most of everything he's written. Did you read I shouldn't, I'm not being a wise guy. You heard the speech he made, almost an hour's worth of speech is why he was going into Ukraine. He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. That's what this is about. And I think that his ambitions are completely contrary to the place where the rest of the world has arrived.
You're confident that these devastating sanctions are going to be as devastating as Russian missiles and bullets and tanks?
Yes, Russian bullets, missiles, and tanks in Ukraine. Yes, I am.
Thank you, President Biden. If sanctions cannot stop President Putin, what penalty can?
I didn't say sanctions couldn't stop him.
You've been talking about the threat of these sanctions for several weeks now.
Yes, but the threat of the sanctions and imposing the sanctions and seeing the effect of the sanctions are two different things. They're two different things. And he's going to begin to see the effect of the sanctions.
And what will that do? How will that change his mindset here, given he's
Because it
attacking
will so
Ukraine as we
weaken his
speak?
country that he'll have to make a very, very difficult choices of whether to continue to move toward being a second-rate power or, in fact, respond.
You said in recent weeks that big nations cannot bluff when it comes to something like this. You recently said that the idea of personally sanctioning President Putin was on the table. Is that a step that you're prepared to take? And if not,
It's not a bluff, it's on the table.
sanctioning President Putin?
Yes.
Why not sanction him today, sir? Mr. President? Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President, if I can, you detailed some severe and swift new sanctions today and said the impact it will have over time. But given the full-scale invasion, given that you're not pursuing disconnecting Russia from what's called SWIFT, the international banking system, or other sanctions at your disposal, respectfully, sir, what more are you waiting for?
Specifically, with the sanctions we've imposed exceed SWIFT. The sanctions we imposed exceed anything that's ever been done. The sanctions we imposed have generated 2/3 of the world joining us. They are profound sanctions. Let's have a conversation in another month or so to see if they're working. Yes.
Can I ask you about Zelensky? Sir, you spoke to Vladimir Zelensky yesterday, sir.
What's the risk that we are watching the beginning of another Cold War, and is there now a complete rupture in U.S. and Russian relations?
There is a complete rupture right now in U.S.-Russian relations if they continue on this path that they're on. And in terms of a Cold War, that depends. You have the vast majority of the rest of the world in total opposition to what he's doing, from Asia to South America to Europe to around the world. And so it's going to be a cold day for Russia. The idea, you don't see a whole lot of people coming to his defense.
And are you, if I could follow up, sir, are you urging China to help isolate Russia? Are you urging China to help isolate Russia?
I'm not prepared to comment on that at the moment. No. Yeah. No. He's had his hand up a long time.
Thank you, Mr. President. How concerned are you that Putin wants to go beyond Ukraine into other countries, and the U.S. will have to get involved if he moves into NATO countries?
Well, if he did move into NATO countries, he will be involved. We will be involved. The only thing that I'm convinced of is if we don't stop now, he'll be emboldened. If we don't move against him now with these significant sanctions, he will be emboldened.
And
look, you know, well, anyway.
And can you talk anything more about your conversation? Mr. President.
Why not sanction Putin directly today?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sir, India, which is a major defense partner of the United States, is India fully with you on the issue of Ukraine and Russia?
Does the Defense Department of the United States?
So India is one of your major defense partners. Is India fully in sync with United States on Russia?
We're in consultation with India today. We haven't resolved that completely.
One more question.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.
President Biden taking questions from the press corps after announcing new sanctions in response to Russian President Vladimir Putin and Russian troops' attack on Ukraine. The American president saying Putin has chosen a war without a cause. Now, the president pledged that America and its allies will emerge more powerful and united through this. He also issued a warning to Russia about attacking America through cyber attacks, threatening an equal and elevated response after that. Many questions from the press corps ranging from the response of countries like China and India to just how far these sanctions truly go and how much they will hurt. Let's head to Hannah Jewell now outside the White House. Our national video reporter can talk to us more about the highlights of the president's remarks. Hannah?
So, Libby, we heard Biden call this a brutal assault and, as he said, a war without a cause. And we got an outline of the new level of sanctions that the president is bringing, that the United States rather is bringing against Russia in tandem with its allies. Those include limiting exports to Russia, affecting technology sectors he was alluding to, as well as defense, limiting Russian access to dollars, euros, pound system, blocking finance to Russian military, preventing Russia from being able to raise money from American investors. He's also added names to a list of individuals receiving more targeted sanctions and cutting off $1 trillion in assets from the U.S. financial system and Russia between those two systems. He kept stressing that this would take time. He said actually to a reporter asking a question, like, come back and ask me in a month if you think this is working. Because he was questioned about, weren't the sanctions meant to prevent this happening in the first place? He denied that. Instead, he focused on how devastating he thought that these sanctions would be. He was asked about why he has not explicitly cut off Russia from SWIFT, why there's been no announcement of that, cutting off Russia from the international banking system. He alluded to the fact that some European allies are not willing to do that and said that his package of sanctions was, in fact, in his words, a bigger deal than cutting off from SWIFT. He also reiterated the United States' commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaties, said that NATO allies would be meeting tomorrow, and that an attack on a NATO ally would be as an attack on the United States. He stressed again that, of course, the U.S. is not right now sending troops to Ukraine, but things would be different if there were a further attack on a NATO allied country to the U.S. in the east. And he also really stressed that these sanctions are designed to maximize impact on Russia, he said, and minimize effects on the U.S. and allies. He said that he knew that Americans were feeling the so-called pain at the gas pump, but of course, in this very interconnected world, there is only so much that he will be able to do to actually totally insulate Americans from what is happening in Europe.
Hannah Jewell, thank you so much. The president speaking to an audience of many with a lot of different agendas and concerns. Let's go to Karin Demerjen, who covers national security. Karin, give us a sense of how intensive these sanctions really are. How much bite do they have?
I mean, look, the banking sanctions, I haven't seen a printed list of exactly what Treasury is doing, and he name-checked only a couple of things. But if he really is sanctioning Russia's largest bank, and he's really sanctioning the VTB, which he did name check, and that the total market capitalization of all these is over $1 trillion, that is serious. Russia's GDP is only about 1.5 trillion a year. And so you're talking about a serious number of assets there, that especially if he's sanctioning the Sberbank level VTB, if Gazprom Bank is in the mix, that will do some real pain. Again, it will take some time, but that is a serious move. You heard a lot of the reporters kind of asking about the SWIFT question. I mean, look, the SWIFT is kind of like the last little drops of cutting Russia off from the banking system. Once you've said you can't do transactions denominated in dollars, pound zeros and everybody's in lockstep on that. It's a very rare institution that's going to say, actually, I kind of feel like it anyway. And that's really the very last little bits that SWIFT would catch. So Biden was right when he's talking about how the impact here is in the banking sector sanctions. I would have liked to have heard a few more details, and I'm sure my colleagues are reporting this as we speak, about what the export controls that you referenced are going to be, because it depends on what industry, it depends on what scope those are. Those could do as much damage to the Russian economy or cause as much complications with the Russian economy in some ways as the banking sanctions could do. And that will determine whether this is going to be an even harder punch than that. So I would say the banking sanctions are serious. It's interesting that the questions were being asked about why Putin wasn't personally being sanctioned yet. That suggests that they are trying to leave something in reserve here, which is in line, I suppose, with what we've been hearing from officials across the board about this is going to get worse and this is just stage one. But again, I think that the details of those export controls, which I'm sure we'll be learning momentarily, are going to be really important for determining whether this is going to hit Russia in the gut or just be kind of a gesture that is more targeted towards certain sectors of the Russian economy that are more tightly bound to their defense apparatus, to their intelligence apparatus, to industries that are operating specifically in connection with Donbass, or whether we're going to see something that is much more of a broad sort of backhand against Russia's connections to the entire global marketplace.
Great things to point out, Karin, and great questions to ask. Let's go to Paul Soni next, who covers national security as well. Paul, let's dig in a little more to what Karin was just laying out for us. There is the question of what's left on the table. What more can the United States and other countries do?
I think the problem that the Biden administration faces here is that it was very, very clear about what sanctions it was going to put on Russia and signaled a lot of this in advance. And the problem with sanctions is that sanctions are more effective when they are unpredictable, when they're unpredicted, both on the target, in terms of the target not being able to prepare, but also in terms of the domestic desire to see a consequence for this action. You saw there in the press corps, people were not satisfied with what he had announced, even though these are pretty significant and harsh sanctions against Russia. People are not satisfied with that because they've already signaled this, and there's no surprise there that makes people feel like, wow, Russia is really getting a punishment that wasn't expected.
So there was a question by reporters about the role of sanctions, right? The threat of the sanctions sort of being the warning versus the sanctions are in place now, you will reap the consequences, and that is now supposed to change the behavior of Vladimir Putin and his allies. Paul, can you give us a sense of what the Biden administration is getting at in terms of a timeline and in terms of how painful these sanctions might be that's different than what perhaps was anticipated or feared by the Russians? As you said, this was all laid out in advance.
I would say this is anticipated entirely by the Russians, and they would have baked this into their calculus before rolling tanks over the border into Ukraine. And I think one of the problems that you face in trying to deter a leader like Putin with sanctions is that if he feels like something is a fundamental national security interest, something that is core to Russia, that he needs to solve for whatever reason, whether that's his historical revisionism or what he perceives as Russia's national security, you're not going to trump that with international pressure. Just by nature of his government and his place in the world and his place within Russia, I think that's going to be a really hard ask. And there's a lot of literature on sanctions and their effectiveness, and they can be effective when you're trying to change, for example, a certain program within a country, but where the country has linkages with the rest of the world, and also where that program is maybe not 100% central to the rationale of the leader. That is not the case here, right? I think Putin has proven over and over and over again that he is willing to go to the wall for Ukraine against the West. He is willing to suffer great cost and take on great risk to pull Ukraine back into Moscow's sphere of influence. And so I just think from the start there was no way that sanctions were gonna deter that.
Let's bring in James Homan to the conversation. James, I'd like to get any more input you have on this question of sort of American warnings, American actions, and then what could come next. President Biden did address the question of just how aggressive Russia could be, not just in terms of Ukraine or even other countries in the region, but globally in terms of cyber and attacks that Russia could launch on the United States, even in that way.
Yeah, absolutely, Libby. And to tack on to Paul's great points, the problem is that Russia cares far more about Ukraine, then the United States cares about Ukraine because they see it, Putin sees it as part of his sphere of influence. It was really striking, putting aside the sanctions part of it. That was the firmest commitment we've seen from President Biden to the U.S. following through on its Article 5 commitments. It was our colleague, the Post's Tyler Pager, who asked the president there at the end, do you expect Putin to go further than Ukraine? Biden saying yes, and reiterating his commitment essentially to go to war with Russia if Putin attacks members of NATO. Here I have the map. The NATO countries are in green. You can see Russia here in yellow, stretching from the US up here all the way over. President Biden not just sending reinforcements to Poland, but also Bulgaria and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Basically saying the U.S. is preparing for spillover, preparing for this to escalate. It's a dramatic statement for an American president to make, but it was also, very decisive, very clear that the U.S. isn't going to tolerate a move beyond Ukraine. The other point, Libby, that you mentioned, which was really striking, was President Biden saying everything's on the table vis-a-vis cyber security, cyber attacks. The president said that the U.S. has been hardening its own cyber defenses over the last year. One of the concerns is we've already seen Russia attacking Ukraine's cyber defenses, doing denial of service attacks, shutting down ATMs, shutting down government websites. There's some risk that that's going to spill over just because Ukrainian networks are connected to other countries in the region. And NATO has said that a cyber attack on a NATO member could constitute an attack that could lead to the invocation of Article 5. That doesn't necessarily mean full-scale conventional war, but there are risks. And one of the things that has been baked into US calculations about sanctions is, will Vladimir Putin try to shut down power plants in the United States, which he has the capability to do? Will he try to shut down pipelines here? And if he does, how will the US respond? And this is what could lead to that cycle of escalation. But very strong words from the president about what he's willing to do. And also it's worth keeping in mind that this was tranche 2. He didn't call it that, but earlier this week he said, this is tranche 1, we're cutting off these banks. Now there's tranche 2. Tranche 3, he has left some things in reserve. He could personally sanction Putin. Didn't rule it out, said it's still on the table. He still could move to kick Russia out of SWIFT. He said, the president acknowledged during that Q&A with reporters that the reason that we're not doing it is mainly because of European objections to doing so. But if Russia starts to be more aggressive, if they move hard into the West, if they threaten Poland, that is the kind of step that could be in tranche 3.
Let's listen to some of President Biden's remarks. The president announced these sanctions that he said would severely limit Russia's ability to do business. Let's listen to this part. We'll have that in just a moment. I'll go to Paul Soni for talking about what we just heard a few moments ago. Paul, there is a question of how crippling this could be for the economy of Russia, so how painful it could be for the average Russian citizen, how painful this could be for the oligarchs, how painful this could be for the wealthy class of Russia, and then how painful this could be for Vladimir Putin. So let's break that down. How much does Putin care if the economy of his people suffers? I mean, how painful is that to him, and how influential are the Russian people?
Well, it's really important to note here that Vladimir Putin has engineered the last couple of years in Russia as a very repressive moment, probably the most repressive moment in the country since the fall of the Soviet Union. So the ability for Russians to express themselves politically, to come out and demonstrate, has been greatly reduced. We've seen some people come out in Russia and protest this war already, but they're taking great risks and they're often being immediately packed off to the police station. So he clearly feels that he has locked down political dissent in the country enough and freedom of press and information enough that whatever outcry there will be within Russia will be minimal and controllable. Similarly, he clearly feels like he has enough power over Russian oligarchs to do whatever he feels like he needs to do in the security space, no matter how much suffering that's going to entail for them. He actually had a meeting today with some of the top Russian oligarchs and essentially told them, as they pleaded with him, to not pull the Russian economy into ruins. He said, we sort of need to do what we need to do. So I'm not sure that is going to be a huge determining factor for him, especially because energy prices are really high, and it would be foolhardy for us to not think that that played into Putin's calculus on timing here. Oil prices are high and have skyrocketed since this invasion happened. Gas prices have been soaring in Europe. That is how the Russian government gets most of its revenue. As Biden said, they are not going to cut off energy sales because they don't want to have an energy crisis in Europe, which is heavily reliant on Russia for oil and gas. And so when that's your main business, I don't think he's going to be that worried.
Let's listen to that excerpt from President Biden's speech talking about what this could do to business.
We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble, which early today hit its weakest level ever in history. The Russia stock market plunged today. The Russian government borrowing rate spiked by over 15%. In today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself, cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen.
President Biden speaking earlier from the White House. Rhonda Colvin, the president, also talked about and then was asked about what pain this could mean for Americans in terms of the stock market and in terms of gas prices. How much is that conversation part of how congressional leaders and the White House are trying to talk about this with the American public and also think through just how aggressive should the U.S. be in response to Russia?
Yeah, I suspect that's going to be a big conversation come next week when Congress returns in session. It's already been discussed on the Hill about this affecting gas prices. So I suspect the White House will continue messaging on that point as well. Biden has said this point about gas prices for the last few weeks, that's probably where we're going to see some impact here on American soil. So as I've said before, in our conversations before he came on, these types of speeches are also about educating Americans about what's going to happen next. So many people may not be following this in and out, but it will almost come to a point where you won't have a choice but to follow it because it is likely to impact us here on American soil. So I would say stay tuned. I mean, this whole thing is a developing story. One thing that I don't know if we've talked about yet is Biden did announce that he will add more air and ground troops in those surrounding areas around Ukraine, and that, of course, there will be that NATO summit tomorrow to discuss that a little bit more. But that's something, too, that Americans will need to be prepared for, that we will be sending more men and women to the region. But again, he did reiterate that we will not be fighting on the ground in Ukraine. So I think today, from what we've heard from the president, is consistent with what we've heard from him before, this week and last week, about this being something that is certainly going to impact Americans.
James, we heard reporters ask, what will stop Vladimir Putin and when does it end? Will he try to extend his grasp beyond Ukraine? So let's talk about how the Biden administration is viewing Putin's end goal. And another part of that, is there the threat of any sort of nuclear strike? That question was asked as well.
On the latter point, Libby, President Biden said he didn't know what President Putin meant when he did make that sort of ominous statement that if you come after me, we're going to do stuff that we've never done before, that you've never seen, which does suggest that he was keeping a nuclear strike on the table. Obviously chilling and terrifying. What's interesting is that Biden said very explicitly that Putin wants to recreate the former Soviet Union. Which would mean not just taking Ukraine, but also bringing in Poland and the Baltic states and Moldova, and putting that all not just in the sphere of influence, but back as part of a Russian empire. This is Putin's revisionism. This is how he sees his legacy. He hopes that it shores up his domestic standing, his historic stature, and that's why the NATO alliance comments were so critical, and the NATO summit tomorrow is so important. The president made very clear that the U.S. is willing to go to war to protect members of NATO, which include several countries that were part of the Soviet bloc. And you could also see some pressure, some efforts by Sweden and Finland. Finland stayed neutral during the Cold War. Finland has had some suggestion. There's some political debate about it internally, but Russia attacking Ukraine could push Finland more toward Europe. Finland potentially could join NATO. Same thing goes for Sweden. Obviously, Norway already a member of NATO. You know, the NATO alliance, as the president said, is the most effective military alliance in history. And frankly, it's very clear, based on Putin's willingness to attack a country the size of Texas, that if the Baltic states, you know, Estonia's only got like 1 million or so people. If the Baltic states weren't members of NATO, Putin would definitely be coming for them. And so that's why it's very important for Biden to project resolve to protect these countries and to explain and bring American people along why it's in our national interest to protect the whole alliance and why an attack on one is an attack on all.
Well, let's bring in Shane Harris, who covers national security and intelligence. Shane, you know, the comments by Vladimir Putin were so remarkable in many ways, and threatening, really threatening, and also a rewrite of history. And we've seen him do that over the subsequent days, weeks, and frankly months. As President Biden talks about, you know, Vladimir Putin having an end goal of reuniting the old Soviet Union, I mean, what does that mean in terms of the American response? James laid out for us where those NATO countries are and where additional troops are being sent. How does the Biden administration have to think 5 steps ahead to what could be coming?
Well, I think it's important that if Putin's ultimate goal is some kind of, you know, post-Soviet reunion or an enlarging of this Russian bloc, then as much as President Biden wants to say and emphasize to the American people, as he did today, that no American forces will be fighting in Ukraine, and he emphasized that, that doesn't mean that we are not going to be sending troops to Europe in greater numbers. It does not mean that Putin will not then pose a threat to NATO states. So we don't want to predict that we're on the precipice of a wider war. I'm not saying that. But the United States is inevitably being drawn into a new conflict now in Europe, precipitated by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. If he succeeds in toppling the government and bringing Ukraine into his sphere of influence, consolidating with Belarus, you're talking about something that starts to look like this vision that a lot of intelligence officials in the US and in Britain that I've talked to feel that Putin has. They see him as this kind of revisionist. They feel that he has a fantasy of something that looks like the old Soviet Union, and of course is threatened by democracies. And the more he expands, the more democracies would then be on his border effectively. So this is not where it ends for the United States. We're at the beginning, early stages of potentially some very new security dynamic in Europe that frankly looks probably a lot more like the Cold War.
What are you going to be watching, Shane? It is nighttime now in Ukraine. We've got that live shot of Kyiv. You know, this all started in the early morning hours there this morning.
I will be watching very closely what happens in Kyiv, as I think everyone is right now. We are seeing reports from U.S. officials and others I've talked to that there's a belief that Russian forces could try to move on Kyiv tonight. There's a question of whether they would try and seize the city or, according to some people I've talked to, possibly try and capture key leaders, possibly including President Zelensky himself, and force him to resign. It does seem like Putin's end goal here is getting the Zelensky government out and replacing it with one that's favorable to him. He could end this war fairly quickly, I think, in his eyes, if he were to do that in Kyiv, and I'll be watching to see the next 24 to 48 hours very closely to see if he makes that move.
Shane Harris, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our colleagues in the Washington Post newsroom who are here in Washington and in Ukraine. And thank you for watching this live coverage from the newsroom of the Washington Post. We'll continue to cover this breaking news story, so stay with us in print, online, and here in YouTube and on our homepage. A coverage note will be live Tuesday night for President Biden's first official State of the Union address, so you'll be able to find us starting at 8 o'clock Eastern time that night. James Hohmann, Rhonda Colvin, and other familiar faces will be joining me, and we will be bringing you all the latest news from Ukraine. Another thing we're watching this week, of course, is President Biden's imminent announcement of his pick to be the next Supreme Court justice. So stay tuned for the Washington Post as we watch that happen as well. I'm Libby Casey. Have a good and safe afternoon.